Marcus Ellison only wanted to fill his gas tank after a long day of work. But when he stepped out of the convenience store, a police officer aimed a weapon at him in front of dozens of witnesses. Because of the color of his skin and the age of his vehicle, he was handcuffed right there in the middle of the gas station. The officer smiled coldly when Marcus calmly said, "I am the governor of this state." Nobody believed him. Until 8 minutes later, when more than 20 state police vehicles came screaming down the highway, sirens tearing through the evening air, and the man who had given the order to handcuff him began to shake. It had been an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blurred into all the others that made up the life of a man who had spent 3 decades in public service. Marcus had grown up the son of a mill worker and a schoolteacher in a small town, not far from where he now served, and he had never fully shed the instincts of that upbringing, no matter how many titles accumulated after his name. He remembered standing in line with his mother at a clinic, much like the one he had just left, remembered the particular exhaustion in the faces of people waiting for a doctor who was already 2 hours behind schedule, and he had promised himself, long before he ever imagined running for office, that if he was ever given real power, he would use it to shorten lines like that one, rather than simply admire them from a distance. Governor Marcus Ellison had just finished touring a rural hospital 2 hours outside the capital, the kind of visit that never made the evening news because there were no cameras waiting for him, no aides trailing behind with notepads, no motorcade of black sedans stopping traffic for blocks. He had insisted, as he always did twice a year, on making these trips alone, driving his own aging Ford Explorer, wearing a plain canvas jacket instead of a suit, because he believed that a man who wanted to understand how ordinary people were treated by the systems he oversaw had to first become an ordinary person himself, if only for an afternoon. The hospital administrator had not recognized him until he introduced himself. And even then, she had laughed a little in disbelief, certain that governors did not walk through waiting rooms unannounced, checking on wait times and asking nurses about their overtime pay. But Marcus did. He always had, since long before he held the title, back when he was still a young lawyer working nights for a legal aid clinic, learning that policy was only real when it touched the life of someone standing in front of you. The sky had turned the color of wet slate by the time he pulled off the interstate and into a small gas station perched on the edge of the highway, its lights humming weakly against the coming dusk. It was the kind of place that existed in every state in the country. A convenience store with a faded sign, 2 rows of pumps, and a bell over the door that rang every time someone walked in. Marcus parked at pump number 3, stepped out, and stretched his back after hours behind the wheel. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered but unassuming, with the kind of face that looked instantly familiar to anyone who paid attention to the news and completely invisible to anyone who did not. Today, dressed the way he was, he blended into the gas station the way a stone blends into a riverbed. Inside the store, he bought a bottle of water and a pack of gum, chatting for a moment with the young man behind the register about the price of diesel, the kind of small talk that came naturally to him because he had never stopped being curious about the lives of strangers. On his way back to his car, he noticed an elderly woman fumbling with a bag of groceries, a carton of eggs sliding dangerously toward the pavement. Marcus moved quickly, catching the carton before it fell, and helped her gather the rest of her bags without a second thought. The woman thanked him, commented that he had kind eyes, and shuffled off toward a rusted pickup truck, never once suspecting that the man who had just saved her eggs from disaster held more executive authority than almost anyone else in the state. It was in that exact moment, as Marcus turned back toward his own vehicle, that Officer Derek Harlan's patrol car rolled slowly past the gas station on the frontage road. Derek was 43 years old, a veteran of the local police force with 19 years on the job, a man who had built his entire identity around the certainty that he was always right, that his instincts had never failed him, and that the badge on his chest gave those instincts the weight of law. He glanced toward the gas station out of habit, the way officers glance at everything, cataloging faces and vehicles without quite realizing they are doing it. His eyes landed on Marcus, on the older Ford Explorer with a chip in its windshield, on the plain jacket, and the unremarkable posture of a man simply living his life. Something shifted behind Derek's eyes, something that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with a lifetime of assumptions he had never bothered to examine. He slowed the patrol car, turned into the gas station lot, and parked at an angle that blocked Marcus's vehicle from pulling away. Derek stepped out of his cruiser with the deliberate, heavy-footed walk of a man who wanted to be noticed before he said a single word. He took in the details the way he always did. An older vehicle, a black man standing beside it, clothing that struck him as inexpensive. No visible reason for a person like this to be driving a car like that in a town like theirs. He did not run the plates first. He did not consider that people of every background drove older vehicles for every possible reason, from thriftiness to sentiment to simple practicality. He did not pause to ask himself why an aging SUV should be treated as evidence of anything at all. Instead, he approached Marcus with his hand resting near his holster and his voice already sharpened into command. "Hands where I can see them," Derek said, stopping several feet away, his tone leaving no room for casual conversation. Marcus, who had spent years learning to read a room before he read a person, immediately raised his hands to shoulder height, palms open, his expression calm rather than startled. He had encountered enough uniforms in enough contexts to know that de-escalation began with stillness, and stillness was something Marcus had cultivated his entire adult life. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice even. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Derek said, ignoring the question, his eyes flicking over Marcus's jacket as though searching for a concealed weapon that did not exist. Marcus reached slowly into his jacket, narrating his movements the way he had once taught his own children to do if they were ever stopped. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," he said, and produced his license, followed by the vehicle registration from the glove box, both handed over without hesitation. Everything was in order. The license bore his real name, his real address, and a photograph that matched the man standing in front of the pumps. The registration matched the vehicle down to the last digit. There was nothing here that should have taken more than 90 seconds to resolve. Yet Derek did not resolve it in 90 seconds. He turned the license over in his hands, as though searching for something wrong with it, asked Marcus where he was coming from, where he was headed, why he was traveling with an out-of-county address on a highway 2 counties away. Questions that had no legal bearing on anything but were designed to produce hesitation, a stumble, some small inconsistency he could seize upon. Marcus answered each question patiently, without irritation, because he understood that his patience was itself a kind of shield, though he also understood, with a tightening in his chest that he did not show on his face, that patience alone would not necessarily be enough. Inside the store, Emma Collins, the station's 34-year-old manager, watched the exchange through the front window while pretending to restock a shelf of motor oil. She had worked at this gas station for 6 years and had seen every kind of traffic stop imaginable happen in that parking lot, routine ones that ended in a warning and a wave, and others that curdled into something uglier within minutes. There was a particular rigidity in Derek's shoulders tonight, a particular refusal to relax, even after seeing a valid license and registration, that made the muscles along Emma's spine tighten in recognition. She had seen Derek here before. She remembered the way he had once detained a delivery driver for 25 minutes over an expired inspection sticker that turned out to be a printing error, and how the driver, a young black man with 2 children in the back seat, had missed his shift and nearly lost his job over it. Emma did not know yet who the man at Pump 3 really was, but she knew, with the plain instinct of someone who had watched this pattern too many times, that whatever was unfolding outside her window had less to do with the law and more to do with the officer's own certainty. A few yards away, near the diesel pumps, Carlos Rivera sat behind the wheel of his idling delivery truck, a phone propped against his dashboard, its camera already rolling. Carlos was 29, a long-haul driver who had learned the hard way, through 2 stops of his own that had gone sideways for no good reason, that a camera was sometimes the only witness that mattered. He had started recording the moment Derek climbed out of his cruiser, quietly, without announcing it, letting the footage speak for whatever was about to happen. He did not yet know that within the hour, the video streaming silently from his dashboard would be watched by more people than had ever attended a single one of his church services, his family reunions, or every birthday party he had thrown in his life combined. Derek's radio crackled, and he called for backup with a tone that suggested urgency where none existed, describing a subject who was, in his words, acting suspicious near the pumps. Within minutes, two more patrol cars rolled into the lot, their headlights sweeping across the concrete, and two additional officers stepped out to flank Marcus on either side. Marcus stood perfectly still at the center of a widening circle of uniforms, his hands still raised, his eyes moving calmly from one officer to another. The gas station, which minutes earlier had held the quiet hum of an ordinary Tuesday evening, had transformed into something closer to a stage, and everyone present, without quite realizing it, had become an audience. One of the newly arrived officers, a younger man named Tyler Woods, who had been on the force barely 2 years, hesitated as he stepped out of his cruiser, his eyes moving over the scene with a flicker of uncertainty that Derek did not share. He glanced at the license and registration papers now resting on the hood of the patrol car, noted that both appeared entirely legitimate, and opened his mouth as though to ask a question. Derek cut him off before he could speak, waving a hand dismissively and telling him to secure the perimeter, a phrase that carried far more weight than the situation actually required. Tyler obeyed, though something in his posture suggested he was complying with an order rather than agreeing with a judgment. A small crack of doubt that would later matter a great deal when investigators asked him, under oath, what he had actually believed in that moment. "Am I being accused of something?" Marcus finally asked, his voice steady but firm enough to carry across the lot. "Because if I am, I would like to know what it is." None of the three officers answered him directly. Derek instead demanded to search the vehicle, stating that the mismatch between the car's age and the man's appearance gave him probable cause, a claim that had no legal foundation whatsoever, but that he delivered as though it were obvious fact. Marcus, who had once taught constitutional law before he ever ran for office, asked calmly whether Derek had a warrant or any specific, articulable reason connected to an actual crime. The question, reasonable as it was, seemed to enrage Derek rather than give him pause. He took a step closer, his jaw tightening, and declared that Marcus's refusal to simply comply was itself suspicious, that an innocent man would have nothing to hide and nothing to argue about. By now, more customers had drifted toward the edges of the lot, drawn by the flashing lights and the raised voices, phones lifting into the air one after another like a field of small silver flowers turning toward the sun. Carlos's video feed, still rolling from his dashboard, had already begun quietly attracting viewers. A slow trickle at first, curious strangers scrolling past a live stream titled, "Simply Traffic Stop Getting Out of Hand," the kind of unremarkable title that could belong to 1,000 different videos on any given night. Nobody watching yet understood what they were about to witness. Emma stepped outside the store, positioning herself near the entrance, her arms crossed, watching Derek with an expression that had shifted from concern into something closer to dread. A man pumping gas at the adjacent island lowered his nozzle and simply stood there, transfixed, no longer pretending to mind his own business. A mother with a small child in the back seat of her minivan rolled down her window a few inches, straining to hear the exchange, one hand instinctively moving to cover her daughter's eyes, as though shielding her from something she sensed was about to turn ugly. The atmosphere in the lot had thickened into the particular, suffocating quiet that settles over a crowd right before something irreversible happens. A held breath multiplied across a dozen strangers who had arrived that evening for nothing more complicated than gasoline, and were now unwilling witnesses to a moment none of them would forget. "Turn around," Derek said abruptly, reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. "Place your hands behind your back." Marcus did not resist. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, and allowed the cold metal to close around his wrists. It was not fear that kept him compliant in that moment, but calculation, the calculation of a man who understood that resistance, however justified, could be twisted into justification for something far worse. As the cuffs clicked shut, Marcus spoke quietly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Officer, you are making a very serious mistake tonight, and I would encourage you to reconsider before this goes any further." Derek laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and glanced toward his fellow officers as if inviting them to share the joke. "If you're the governor, he said. "Then I'm the President of the United States." Nobody standing in that parking lot laughed with him, though he seemed to expect they would. Emma took a half step forward, opening her mouth as though to explain something, then closed it again, unsure whether speaking would help or simply give Derek another target for his irritation. The murmur among the onlookers grew louder, a low current of disbelief rippling through the crowd, the collective recognition that something had gone very wrong, though none of them yet knew how wrong, or how quickly the consequences would arrive. Marcus, standing with his wrists bound behind him under the flickering gas station lights, made one more request, quiet but unmistakably deliberate. "I am asking you, formally, to contact the governor's office," he said. "You can verify everything I have told you in less than 5 minutes." Derek refused outright, telling him that he did not take orders from a man in handcuffs, that if Marcus wanted to make a phone call, he could make it after processing. Marcus asked, just as calmly, whether he could at least call an attorney, a right that existed independent of anyone's opinion about his identity. That request, too, was denied, Derek insisting there would be time for lawyers later, after they had sorted out whatever Marcus was really up to. It was a small, procedural cruelty layered on top of a larger one, the kind of denial that revealed, more clearly than anything else that evening, how completely Derek had convinced himself that the normal rules did not apply to whatever situation he believed himself to be handling. What none of them knew, standing under those buzzing lights, was that 300 miles away, inside a converted conference room that served as the security operations center for the governor's office, a young staffer named Priya Chandrasekaran had just received an automated alert. Part of her job involved monitoring public digital chatter for any mention of the governor's name, a low-priority task most days that mostly caught nothing more alarming than parody accounts or rehashed political attacks. Tonight, the alert had pulled up something different, a small but rapidly climbing live stream, its caption mentioning handcuffs and a gas station, tagged with a location less than 40 miles from where the governor's last known GPS ping had placed his personal vehicle 2 hours earlier. Priya's stomach dropped the instant she opened the stream, and saw, unmistakably, despite the plain jacket and the failing light, the face of the man she had watched deliver a budget address just 3 weeks before. She did not waste a second. Within 90 seconds, she was on the phone with Chief William Harper of the state police, a man of 58 years, who had spent his entire career believing he had already seen the worst that police work could produce, only to discover, in the space of a single sentence from a trembling young staffer, that he had not. "Chief," Priya said, her voice tight but clear, "the governor is being detained at a gas station off exit 41. He's in handcuffs. It's on a public live stream right now." Harper did not ask her to repeat herself. He did not pause to question whether the report might be exaggerated. He simply stood up from his desk, walked into the hallway, and gave a series of orders in a voice that made every officer within earshot stop what they were doing. Verify the governor's GPS location immediately. Pull every available state police unit within a 30-mile radius. Dispatch to the coordinates from the live stream with lights and sirens. Treat it as a protective emergency, not a routine call. Do not, under any circumstances, wait for further confirmation before moving. Within 4 minutes, more than 20 state police vehicles were converging on the same stretch of interstate, their engines roaring, their radios alive with terse, urgent chatter. None of the officers driving toward that gas station yet knew the full details of what they would find, only that the governor of their state, a man under their sworn protection, had somehow ended up in restraints in front of a convenience store, and that whatever had happened there was about to become one of the most consequential nights of their careers. Back at the gas station, the tension in the parking lot had thickened into something almost physical. Marcus stood quietly between two officers, his wrists still bound, his expression composed even as the minutes stretched on. In the distance, faint at first, a new sound began to rise above the murmur of the crowd, a low mechanical hum that grew steadily louder, resolving slowly into the unmistakable wail of sirens, not one, but many, layered on top of one another in a chorus that seemed to be approaching from every direction at once. Derek straightened at the sound, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. He assumed, without any real basis, that this must be additional backup arriving in response to his own earlier call, confirmation in his mind that he had been right to escalate, right to demand compliance, right about everything. He allowed himself a small, self-satisfied smile, glancing toward Marcus as though the approaching sirens were proof of his authority rather than a verdict on his judgment. The first vehicles to crest the rise near the exit ramp were not the local backup Derek expected, but a line of dark, unmarked Dodge Chargers bearing the unmistakable markings of the state police, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested this was no ordinary response. Behind them came black SUVs, their windows tinted, followed by a command vehicle bristling with antennas, and finally 2 tactical support units that pulled up at angles designed to secure the perimeter rather than simply park. Within seconds, the gas station that had held perhaps a dozen curious onlookers now held what looked like the staging ground for a small motorcade, headlights washing over the pumps in overlapping waves of white and red and blue. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Even Carlos, still recording from behind his windshield, felt his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the angle of his phone, sensing instinctively that whatever he was capturing had just become something far larger than a single traffic stop gone wrong. Sergeant Linda Brooks, 46 years old, and the commanding officer of the responding state police detail, stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had even fully stopped rolling. She had spent 22 years in law enforcement, most of them earning a reputation for a kind of unshakable, procedural toughness that made both criminals and careless colleagues equally nervous in her presence. She scanned the scene in an instant, taking in the local patrol cars, the small crowd, the man in handcuffs standing quietly near the pumps, and Derek, whose satisfied expression was already beginning to falter under the weight of her arrival. Linda did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her question landed across the lot with the force of a gunshot. Who put handcuffs on the governor? For a moment, nobody spoke. Derek's mouth opened and then closed again, the color draining slowly from his face as the full weight of the question settled over him. One of the 2 backup officers, standing near Marcus, took an involuntary step backward, as though physically retreating from responsibility. Emma, standing near the store entrance, pressed a hand to her chest, and somewhere in the gathered crowd, someone let out a low, disbelieving exhale. "I asked a question," Linda said, walking forward now, her eyes moving from Derek to Marcus and back again. "Which one of you put handcuffs on Governor Ellison?" Derek finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than he intended. "We didn't know," he said. There was no indication he wasn't cooperating. He didn't have any identification that he handed you a valid license and registration, Emma interrupted, stepping forward despite the tightness in her throat. "I watched the whole thing through the window. Everything he gave you matched. You kept him here anyway." Linda held up a hand, silencing the exchange, and moved directly to Marcus, her expression shifting instantly from command to something closer to mortification. She reached for the handcuffs herself, releasing them with practiced efficiency, and as the metal fell away from his wrists, she straightened to her full height and delivered a formal apology on behalf of every officer present, her voice carrying clearly across the silent lot. "Governor, I am deeply sorry for what has happened here tonight. This should never have occurred, and it will be investigated fully, starting immediately." Behind her, without needing to be told, the state police officers who had arrived in the convoy straightened into a formal line and offered a crisp, unified salute, a gesture that seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of gas pumps and flickering fluorescent signage. The onlookers who had gathered at the edges of the lot stood frozen, several of them lowering their phones slightly, not from a loss of interest, but from a kind of collective disbelief, the sense of watching history reorganize itself in real time. Derek stood apart from the group now, his earlier bravado replaced by a stunned, hollow expression, the posture of a man watching the version of events he had constructed in his own mind collapse in front of dozens of witnesses. He opened his mouth once more, some instinct for self-preservation pushing him to attempt an explanation, insisting that he had simply been following procedure, that the vehicle had matched a pattern, that anyone in his position would have made the same call. Linda turned toward him with an expression that offered no comfort whatsoever. There is no procedure that requires handcuffing a man who has handed you a valid license and registration and answered every question you asked, she said. We will be reviewing everything. Your body cam, the gas station's security footage, dispatch logs, radio traffic, all of it. Marcus, rubbing his wrists but otherwise composed, raised a hand slightly, a small gesture that nonetheless drew every eye in the parking lot. Sergeant, he said, I appreciate your response, and I appreciate your officer's professionalism tonight. But I want to be clear about something before this goes any further. I am not interested in special treatment because of my title. I am interested in the truth of exactly what happened here. Documented completely, the same as it would be for any other citizen. Linda nodded, understanding immediately the significance of what he was asking. Within the hour, the gas station's internal camera system had been secured under state police custody, its footage backed up before anyone could suggest, even accidentally, that it had been damaged or lost. Derek's body cam, along with the body cams of the two officers who had responded to his initial call, was collected and logged. The dispatch recordings from the moment Derek requested backup were pulled from the county system, and copies were made of every radio transmission exchanged that evening. Carlos's video, still circulating and gaining viewers by the thousand with each passing minute, was preserved as well, an independent record that would later prove impossible for anyone to dismiss or explain away. What the footage revealed, once investigators sat down to review it in full, left little room for interpretation. Derek's own body camera had captured, in his own voice, comments made under his breath to the two backup officers before Marcus was ever handcuffed. Remarks about the age of the vehicle, about who normally drove cars like that, about assumptions that had nothing to do with any actual violation of law, and everything to do with the color of the man standing in front of him. The footage showed, second by second, that Marcus had never raised his voice, had never made a threatening movement, had complied with every instruction given to him, even as those instructions grew increasingly unreasonable. It showed Emma's face through the store window, her growing alarm plainly visible well before she ever stepped outside. It showed Carlos's truck, parked at a careful angle, capturing an unobstructed view of everything that unfolded. Chief Harper arrived at the scene less than 20 minutes after the state police convoy, having driven the distance himself rather than wait for a briefing over the phone. He was a broad, silver-haired man who had built his reputation over 3 decades on a simple, unbending principle that the badge existed to protect people, not to punish them for existing in places someone else thought they did not belong. When he stepped out of his vehicle and saw Marcus standing calmly near the pumps, his own anger, which had been building steadily during the drive, hardened into something colder and more focused. He did not raise his voice either, though the fury in his eyes was unmistakable to everyone who looked at him. He walked directly to Derek, who by now had been separated from the crowd and stood near his own patrol car under the watch of 2 state police officers. "Officer Harlan," Harper said, "hand over your badge and your service weapon. You are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation." Derek's protests, weaker now, dissolved almost entirely under the weight of Harper's expression. He surrendered his badge and weapon, without further argument, his hands trembling slightly as he did so, the reality of the evening finally settling over him in its full, unavoidable weight. Within the week, the state's Department of Justice had opened its own independent civil rights inquiry, a process that would eventually examine not only tonight's incident, but a pattern of prior complaints against Derek that had, until now, been quietly filed away and largely ignored. Harper himself did not leave the matter to subordinates. He personally reviewed every page of Derek's personnel file that night, sitting alone in his office long after the gas station had been cleared, and the crowd dispersed, and what he found troubled him almost as much as the footage itself. There were 6 prior complaints spanning 9 years, each one investigated internally, and each one closed with a note reading, in one form or another, that no policy violation could be substantiated. Reading them now, in light of everything he had just witnessed, Harper recognized the same pattern repeating itself across every complaint. A stop that should have taken minutes stretching into an hour, a request for a supervisor denied, a citizen's account dismissed in favor of an officer's word. He resolved, before he left his office that night, that the department's entire complaint review process would be rebuilt from the ground up, and that no future finding would be closed without an independent set of eyes outside the officer's own chain of command. By the time the first television vans arrived at the gas station, drawn by the same viral footage that had already reached hundreds of thousands of viewers, Marcus had regained his composure entirely, though something in his eyes had shifted, a weight settling there that had not existed a few hours earlier. He declined to give an extensive statement that night, aware that exhaustion and adrenaline made for poor public communication, but he did pause for a single, brief moment in front of the assembled reporters, long enough to deliver a sentence that would be replayed across the country within hours. "Tonight, I was treated the way too many of our citizens are treated every single day," Marcus said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The only difference is that when it happened to me, 20 state police cars arrived in 8 minutes. Every citizen deserves that same urgency, that same protection, and that same respect, regardless of what they are wearing or what they drive." The sentence spread far beyond the borders of the state within a single night, carried by news outlets, shared and reshared, until it had appeared on screens in cities the governor had never visited, and among people who had never heard his name before that evening. Carlos's original live stream, initially watched by a few dozen strangers, scrolling past a gas station on a random Tuesday, climbed past 10 million views within 48 hours, its comment sections filling with disbelief, outrage, and, gradually, something more complicated than either. In the days that followed, the gas station itself became an unlikely landmark, visited by reporters, community organizers, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted to stand at the spot where the story had unfolded. Peaceful demonstrations formed in several cities across the state, organized not around anger alone but around a specific, concrete demand for accountability and reform. Demonstrations that Marcus himself, still recovering from the immediate shock of the event, encouraged to remain measured and focused rather than combustible. He understood, perhaps better than most, that lasting change required discipline as much as outrage, and he said as much in every interview he gave. Something unexpected also began to happen within the ranks of law enforcement itself. A number of officers, uncomfortable with what they had seen in the footage and unwilling to let a single incident define their entire profession, spoke publicly about the need for better training, describing patterns they had witnessed themselves over the years, but had lacked the platform or the courage to challenge directly. Several police academies across the state, prompted by public pressure, but also by a genuine reckoning within their own leadership, announced expanded curricula focused on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and civil rights law, changes that had been proposed for years, but had never found sufficient political will until now. Emma Collins, who had quietly stepped forward to confirm every detail Marcus had described, found herself unexpectedly celebrated for what she considered simply telling the truth. The gas station's owner, moved by her composure under pressure, gave her a substantial bonus and a promotion to regional oversight, though Emma herself remained more focused on the fact that her small act of honesty had mattered at all. She gave a handful of interviews, always careful to note that she had done nothing extraordinary, only refused to look away from something happening in front of her. Carlos Rivera, meanwhile, became something of a reluctant public figure, his footage cited repeatedly in news coverage, and eventually entered as key evidence in both the internal investigation and the broader civil rights inquiry. He continued driving his usual routes, uncomfortable with the sudden attention but quietly proud that his instinct to press record, born from his own uneasy history with law enforcement, had ended up protecting someone else entirely. In interviews, he spoke plainly about why he had started filming in the first place, describing 2 incidents from his own past when no camera had been present to record what happened to him, incidents that had never received any accountability at all. As the investigation widened, Several other individuals came forward with their own accounts of encounters with Derek Harlan over the years, describing patterns eerily similar to what had happened at the gas station. Unnecessary escalation, disproportionate suspicion, complaints filed, and then quietly dismissed without meaningful review. Investigators began reopening a handful of these older cases, and in at least 2 instances, previous rulings were formally reconsidered in light of the new scrutiny. It became increasingly clear that the events at the gas station had not been an isolated failure of judgment, but the visible tip of something that had been allowed to persist, unexamined, for far too long. State lawmakers, sensing both the public mood and a genuine opportunity for reform, introduced a package of bills within a month of the incident, proposals that included mandatory independent review for every citizen complaint against an officer, expanded funding for body camera storage and audits, and a requirement that any request from a detained individual to contact legal counsel be honored within a fixed and reasonable window of time. Marcus, though he had initially hesitated to attach his own name too closely to legislation born from his personal ordeal, eventually agreed to testify before the State Senate Committee reviewing the bills, describing the events at the gas station not as a story about himself, but as a data point representative of thousands of encounters that never received a camera, a live stream, or 20 state police cars racing to the rescue. His testimony, delivered without notes and without theatrics, proved decisive in moving several undecided lawmakers towards support, and the reform package passed within the same legislative session, a pace almost unheard of for measures of that scope. Sergeant Linda Brooks, whose composed handling of the scene that night had itself drawn public attention, was asked to help design the new statewide training curriculum on de-escalation and constitutional stops, a role she accepted, somewhat reluctantly, insisting that she was a field officer first, and an instructor only by necessity. Under her guidance, cadets across the state began training not merely on the letter of the law, but on the practical, human cost of assumptions made in the first 10 seconds of any encounter, using the gas station incident, stripped of names and titles, as a central case study in what could go wrong when instinct replaced verification. Months passed. The initial storm of media coverage eventually gave way to the slower, steadier work of institutional reform, court proceedings, and policy debate, the kind of change that rarely trends but often matters more in the end than any single viral moment. Derek Harlan's case moved through both the internal disciplinary process and the state's civil rights investigation, the outcome inevitable to anyone who had reviewed the evidence honestly, though the process itself took the deliberate, careful shape that due process required, even for a man whose own conduct had shown so little of it to others. On a quiet evening in early spring, long after the news vans had gone and the story had faded from daily headlines, Marcus Ellison found himself back on that same stretch of interstate, driving the same Ford Explorer, though this time with no illusions about anonymity, since his face had become known to nearly everyone in the state by then. He pulled into the gas station without any advance notice, without security detail trailing behind him, without cameras waiting to capture the moment. He simply wanted, in his own words later, to see the place again, not as a site of trauma, but as a place that had, in its strange and painful way, revealed something true about the state he had sworn to serve. Emma was working the register when he walked through the door, and she looked up with immediate recognition, though her expression carried none of the strain it once had. Marcus crossed the small store and extended his hand, and she shook it, her grip firm despite the slight tremble of emotion in her voice as she spoke. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, "for not staying silent that night." Emma shook her head slightly, as though the gratitude embarrassed her. "I just told the truth," she said. "Anyone would have done the same." Marcus considered that for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than argumentative. "I've spent enough years in public life to know that isn't always true," he said, "but I'm grateful it was true of you." Before he left, he noticed a small plaque mounted near the entrance of the store, unassuming, easy to miss unless one were looking directly at it, placed there quietly by the station's owner, sometime in the preceding months. The engraved words were simple, unadorned by any political language or reference to the specific events that had inspired them. "Justice begins when someone refuses to look away. Marcus read the words twice, a small, private smile crossing his face, and then, without further comment, he walked back out into the cool evening air. He climbed into his vehicle, started the engine, and pulled slowly out of the lot, the same pumps and the same fading light surrounding him. As they had on the night, everything changed, though the highway ahead now felt different somehow. Wider, longer, carrying with it the quiet, steady momentum of change that had begun in the most unlikely of places, a gas station on the edge of an interstate, on an ordinary evening that had refused, in the end, to stay ordinary. The greatest power any official can hold does not come from a title or a seal of office, but from the simple guarantee that every citizen stands equal before the law. When prejudice is allowed to guide authority, justice itself is placed in chains. But when the truth is finally spoken aloud, no set of handcuffs, however tightly closed, can hold justice back for long.